Welcome back. We're going to continue talking about tissues, and now we're going to be moving into the various types of connective tissues in the body. Now, the connective tissues occupy a lot of space in your body, and there are a number of different types of connective tissues that we'll discuss, some of their different features and properties so that we can learn to tell the differences from them. All right, so as I just mentioned, connective tissues are very abundant in the body, and in fact, they are the most abundant and widely distributed types of tissues that your body is constructed from. And in fact, they differ so much that you would almost never know that some of these types of tissues are actually related to each other. They're divided up into 4 classes. So a number of connective type tissues fall into a category called connective tissue proper. So we'll discuss some more specific types of those. And then you have cartilage is actually a type of connective tissue. You know of cartilage more as like gristle on the ends of chicken bones. That's cartilage. Bone tissue is actually a type of connective tissue. And then this is usually the one that's the most surprising for people. Blood is actually considered to be a type of connective tissue, believe it or not, even though it is has a liquid type consistency. Okay, and then this is a table from your textbook which outlines for you these 4 different major types of connective tissues: your connective tissue proper, cartilage, bone, and blood. And then on this table, what's kind of nice about it is it breaks down, okay, so what are your different categories of proper connective tissues? What are your different kinds of cartilage? What are your different types of bone, which we'll worry about that more so when we get to the next unit, Unit 3, when we study the skeletal system, and then and some features there about the blood. So that's kind of a nice little outline of these tissues for you. Major functions. All right, so connective tissues are very diverse, so they have many different functions. We already talked about some of these in the first video lecture for the unit. Binding. So if you think about the skin as an epithelial tissue, the outermost portion of it, and then you have muscles underneath. Well, what's helping to attach your skin to the underlying muscles? That's binding, and those are connective tissues that do that. Support, like your skeletal system, is a type of connective tissue that provides support and framework for the body. The skeletal system also protects. But if you think about it, your fatty tissues can also provide some protection as well, and fatty tissues are a type of connective tissue. Fatty tissues insulate, so they can insulate, they help prevent heat loss. Transportation, again, your blood is a type of connective tissue, and always think about your blood as the transporter, carries things around from one location to another in the body. Connective tissues, again, they're very diverse, so that means you're going to have varying degrees of vascularity, and again, vascularity refers to blood vessels. And we're going to hear more about that when we think about how well tissues heal, or how well they grow, or how well they regenerate. That is very tied into the blood supply, because tissues that have a good blood supply have lots of nutrients. They have lots of oxygen gas. They can do a lot of metabolism, so it's easy for them to make all their cell parts and divide and make new cells. So they're going to heal and they're going to grow more quickly. Tissues that have a poor blood supply are going to be slower at doing things like healing and making repairs and growing. So at vascularity, that's one of those things you need to plant in your mind early. Blood supply equals activity and growth and metabolism and repair. Associate those types of things with good blood supply. Your connective tissues, as we talked about in the first video lecture, you do have cells in connective tissues. You got to have cells there. Cells are the things in the body that make all of the stuff, that take in nutrients and harness those and make all of the important organic substances in the body. And then cells are surrounded by what we call the extracellular matrix. So we've talked about that already. That's the filler spaces in between. The matrix consists of 2 different types of things. This has kind of a weird name: ground substance and fibers. And so we'll see more about what that's referring to. What in the world do we mean by ground substance? That's kind of a weird name. All right, so if you've got, here's a connective tissue. In many connective tissues, the cells in the tissue are kind of scattered around. And so you've got quite a bit of filler space in there. And then as we're going to see, you've got a lot of protein fibers that extend through the tissue. And we'll talk about some of these different protein fibers and what they do. So those are not cells, those are actually proteins built from amino acids, and they're big proteins, and they help fill in the spaces in there. Okay, so all this stuff in between the cells and all those protein fibers in there, everything else in there consists of ground substance. So the yellow stuff I just colored in there will be the ground substance. All right, so what do you have in that yellowish stuff I just colored in there? You've got your interstitial fluid. So remember, that's another name for tissue fluid. The extracellular fluids that are surrounding cells, those are called interstitial fluids. You have some proteins in there in addition to these. When I'm not thinking about those blue fibers I just colored in, you've got smaller proteins that are floating around in there in the ground substance. And they're a good way to think about those is they almost function like glue. They help attach the cells in there to the fibers and help hold everything in place. So you'll have some little proteins in there that are kind of holding, gluing all those different tissue parts together. Another thing you'll read about if you're reading along in your textbook, proteoglycans. So if you remember, we've heard the term glycoprotein before. That is a protein that has some sugars attached to it, carbohydrates attached to it. A proteoglycan also is a protein, but it's got like a smaller protein and then big polysaccharides attached to it. So it's more polysaccharide than protein. A glycoprotein is actually more protein than polysaccharide. So you have a lot of these proteoglycans. I'll just abbreviate those as PG. Those are big molecules, these protein carbohydrate combinations, and they're sitting in there in that ground substance area. And one of these, I bet you might have heard of this one before. Chondroitin sulfate is a type of proteoglycan. Some people take supplements of that because chondroitin sulfate produced by animals is very much like our chondroitin sulfate. It's the same stuff. So if your digestive system takes that in, and then you've got the building blocks to make more of your own chondroitin sulfate in your tissues. So a lot of people feel like this can help out with your joints. Your joints have connective tissues, cartilage, and so you have a lot of this chondroitin sulfate in the ground substance in your cartilages. And so it's thought that taking that in as a supplement can help you maintain your joint cartilages and protect your joints and help out with that. All those polysaccharides in there, sugar, you guys know if you stuck sugar out on the kitchen counter on a humid day, it's going to get sticky pretty quickly because it's going to absorb water out of the atmosphere. So carbohydrates attract water like magnets. Magnets love carbohydrates. So because of that, these guys, these proteoglycans, absorb a lot of water. So they keep your tissues hydrated. Very important. And then they also, you know how something like honey or syrup that has a lot of sugar in it is very thick and sticky? Well, these proteoglycans are pretty much the same thing. When you have those dissolved in this ground substance of your connective tissues, it's going to thicken that fluid that you have there. So the ground substance is not really liquidy like water. It's going to be have a much thicker, almost like a gelatin type consistency to it. All right, what about these fibers that we said we have running through our connective tissues? There are three major types. Collagen, which is, and all of these are built from proteins. These are protein fibers. Okay? And proteins are built by your cells. Your cells make these. So the cells in the connective tissues actually produce these fibers, and then they release them into their surroundings. So they're actually constructing all of these things. Collagen, these are big protein fibers, I mean big on the tissue scale, the cell scale. These are big. They're very strong fibers. They're almost rope-like, again, down at the tissue microscopic layer. And collagen fibers provide what we call tensile strength or tensile strength. And this is something you want to know. That causes those tissues to resist pulling. If I'm taking my lip here and pulling it out like this, why can I not take my lip and just rip it off really easily? It's because in the connective tissues of my face here, those connective tissues have a lot of these collagen fibers in them, and those collagen fibers resist pulling. They provide tensile or tensile strength to those tissues. So that's what prevents you from just being able to rip off pieces of your body with ease. Then you also have some other tissues. You have some other fibers in connective tissues called elastic fibers. And they're built from elastin. Elastin is a protein. It's a thread-like protein, and you weave a bunch of those together, and you wind up with an elastic fiber. So it's almost like a rope is built from lots of threads that are woven together. As the name suggests, these rebound. So they provide elasticity or ability to rebound to your tissue. So when I was pulling out my lip a minute ago, the collagen fibers were preventing me from ripping my lip off. And then why did my lip go back into place easily? Because of the elastic fibers in that tissue. Think about with my skin as well. If you pull up a piece of your skin, it goes back into place. Doesn't do that quite as well as you get older, as you guys are going to see as you get older. Those nice little fibers we have in our skin and other tissues break down over time, and we don't replace them as easily, and so that's why your tissues tend to become less elastic as you get older. And there's a third type called reticular fibers, which are actually, they're built from collagen proteins. They're related to collagen, but they're thinner and they're kind of webby and branched. And so they provide some of the filling in connective tissues, and they're especially abundant in certain types of tissues like your lymph nodes, as we'll see. All right, here's a nice little diagram from your textbook that I kind of like. It is showing you a generic type of connective tissue. That's what we'll think of this as, kind of a generic connective tissue. Probably better to think of this as a generic connective tissue proper. So there will still be variation between different types of these proper connective tissues as we discuss some of those as we continue on. So they're showing you here in this diagram. So you've got some cells in here. You've got a capillary, that is a microscopic blood vessel, which is passing through the tissue. So you've got that there. And then you've got the various fibers in there, collagen, elastic, and reticular fibers scattered around in there in the extracellular matrix. So these are all your cell types over here. Extracellular matrix consists of the ground substance, so that's what we were just talking about. You got water, and then you've got those proteoglycans, and you've got those glue proteins helping to hold all those things that you see on the diagram in place. You got your collagen fibers, which resist pulling, provide tensile strength. Elastic fibers allow rebound if those tissues get stretched. And then the reticular fibers in there are providing some framework and support to the tissue. Capillary, again, blood passes through here, and the water and other solutes in the blood pass out and into the surrounding tissue fluid. So the capillary is bringing all the good stuff. Also, the capillaries will take away the wastes. The waste will move into the capillaries to take those out. Some cell types in here. All right, this is the one I really want to highlight for you, the fibroblasts. So this guy right here, this kind of spiky looking purple cell you see, that's a fibroblast. There's its nucleus. So you have those scattered around in your proper connective tissues, and those are the cells that make all those fibers, and they make the various molecules of the ground substance. They make those and secrete them. So those are your workhorse cells there in the connective tissues. So get used to thinking about that. Fibroblasts are the key cell type then in these proper connective tissues. Some of the other things you see on here, here's fat cells. Fat cells store fat. They store energy for you. Macrophages, I want you, remember, do you remember phage? We said a little bit during Unit 1 can refer to eating, like phagocytosis, remember that. Macrophages do phagocytosis. They engulf by endocytosis, that type of endocytosis we call phagocytosis. They engulf things into little vesicles, take them inside, and digest them. They're kind of like the vacuum cleaners of your tissues. So if you had an infection in this tissue, if you had bacteria in here or viruses, the macrophages are going to engulf those and digest them. What if you had damage to this tissue, like you had a burn or a wound? Macrophages come in and digest those damaged and worn out cell parts. So they're very important as well. The other cell types you see here, lymphocytes, mast cells, and neutrophils are all involved with fighting infections and also with inflammation. Mast cells help trigger a process called inflammation. When you have damage or an infection. Those cells detect that. Like if you had a cut in this tissue, those mast cells detect the cut and they send these chemical signals out to trigger inflammation. So you'll have swelling of the tissue, you'll have the redness and the pain that you associate with inflammation. And it's doing that to call in these lymphocytes and neutrophils. Those are white blood cells that come in as warriors to help, and the macrophages too will be called in to help clean up the damage and fight any infections that are taking place. That's what your mast cells wind up doing for you. They're kind of guardians against, or they sound alarms when you have damage or infection in a tissue. All right, so that's an introduction to connective type tissues of the body. And so on the next lecture clip, we're going to talk about some specific proper type connective tissues that are called the loose connective tissues. So you have loose connective tissues and you have dense connective tissues, and so we'll see what the differences are between those two types.